Okay, so as I mentioned, we have chosen this book as our kind of kickoff to summer book club discussion here at the library. Can you summarize? I'd love to hear authors summarize their own books. So can you, and you can, spoilers are welcome because we've
Okay, everybody's read it here.
read it and we really want to talk about the spoilers. So can you just quickly summarize this amazing novel for us in your own words?
Yeah, so mostly true story of Tanner and Louise is about an 84-year-old woman named Louise who has suffered a hip injury, and all of her adult children insist that she needs live-in care. And Louise does not want live-in care, but she loses that battle to her adult children. And so the live-in care comes in the form of 21-year-old college dropout Tanner, who does not want to be live-in care. But she, you know, her options are quite limited in where she is in her life. And so the two become roommates and are happy to ignore each other until one night Louise bursts into Tanner's room at 1 a.m. holding a bag full of cash and insisting they leave town immediately. And thus begins an epic cross-country adventure where the two of them are trying to outrun the mistakes of Louise's past and the police who are hot on their trail.
That's a great summary. I love it. You've practiced.
I've done that before, I have to admit.
So for those of us who aren't very familiar with your other works or with you as an author, you've been writing for a while. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your childhood, where you grew up. Do you take a lot of road trips? Did you love to write as a kid?
Yeah, so I grew up in Greenville, South Carolina. And I did love to write as a kid. I mean, my mom likes to say ever since I could hold a crayon, I've been writing books, and she literally has stacks up in like boxes in her attic. I always wanted to be an author. I, of course, wanted to be a children's book author because that's what I was reading. And then when I moved into, you know, Babysitter's Club and Sweet Valley Twins, and I thought I would be a middle grade YA author. And then, you know, went on to wanting to be like a adult author, you know, as I got older, but I wasn't quite sure how to do that. Like, I didn't know anybody that was an author, or like how you actually got into, you know, not just writing books, but publishing them. And so in college, I very naturally gravitated toward journalism because, you know, storytelling, it just really appeals to me, even if I'm telling other people's stories. And so I graduated with my degree in journalism from University of Georgia, and then I went into magazines, and I worked for the glamorous Boating World magazine. That's how I started my career. And then I moved on to Women's Health and Fitness, and then Marie Claire. And then I freelanced for many years after my on-staff positions, and then started writing books. And here we are.
That's amazing. That's great. So Tanner and Louise, you know, as librarians, we hear a lot of we get to see a lot of the journals, pre-published things, and right away, I mentioned this to our book club too, but right away, the Thelma and Louise thing just caught my attention because I mean, I don't know anyone who doesn't love that book. I mean, love that movie. And so immediately from the cover, from whatever, I'm like, oh, I know I'm gonna love this. And I had to get my hands on it. And I picked it as a summer book before we even, like, I really knew much about it.
I love that.
Yeah, I just knew this was gonna be the book. And I feel like I was very right there. Like, everyone has been talking about it. So how did this story come to you? What was the inspiration for Tanner and Louise to you? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so really it's two things. I mean, and the most obvious is the movie Thelma and Louise, which is one of my very favorite movies. I think I first saw it when I was like 14 or 15. And I am very happy to say that it holds up. I rewatched it as part of my research for the book, and it is still excellent, you know, some 30 years later.
I'm going to interrupt you for a minute because I'm just wondering, and we talked about this last week. The movie changes a little bit for you as you get older. Did you find that too? Like, as a woman, through state, like, because I think I watched it pretty young also,
Yep.
and then watched it again, and I was like, wow, I don't remember how powerful and profound this was back
Yes.
then. Did you find that too?
Absolutely, and particularly for its time. I mean, I really think it
yeah.
captured what it meant to be a woman, in our culture in the early 90s. And for me, I definitely started to understand the anger, I think, a lot more as I got older, of course. But yeah, it's just such an iconic, like, feminist film, and I absolutely love it. And of course, the road trip part and the dark comedy aspect of it, those are all like right up my alley. And so I always wanted to do a road trip-esque book because I think that's so much fun. And really, the idea for the story came to me from my own close relationship with my grandmother. So my grandmother, her name was Colleen Oakley, and she was one of my very favorite people on earth. And she lived to the wonderful, ripe old age of 92. She passed away a few years ago, right before COVID. And she was just an incredible woman in so many ways, but she was very pragmatic. She was very sharp and witty, very fun to be with, very adventurous. And she and I had just a really special relationship. I think there's something about grandmothers and granddaughters that's special anyway, but for us, like, as I got older and became an adult, our relationship got so much more deep and emotional and connected. We just really connected. And we spent a lot of time together. We talked often. We would take our own road trips together. And she was just a really, really wonderful woman. And a few years before she passed, she was diagnosed with late onset Parkinson's, which is, anybody who's dealt with that, it's a really, really difficult condition for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that's especially hard is that the medications that doctors put you on to keep the symptoms of Parkinson's at bay have their own really difficult side effects. And so for my grandmother, that came in the form of hallucinations and really vivid dreams. So she started to have trouble deciphering what was real and what was not. That made our weekly phone calls a lot more interesting.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So my grandmother started to say some really alarming things. Like one time she asked me, I said, what'd you do this week, Grandma? What you been up to? And she said, I went on a submarine tour. It was lovely.
Wow.
And then another time she asked me if I had sent a check for her for $10,000 to New Jersey. And I said, well, no, I haven't. What for? And she said, to pay off my gambling debts.
Oh, how funny.
So, things like that started coming up, and she was saying those type of things to other people in my family. And we started sharing these stories, partly because they were funny and my grandmother herself would have thought they were hilarious. But also because what better way to deal with grief and the grief of what was happening than through humor.
Yeah.
But of course, my novelist brain, the wheels started turning, and I thought, what if my grandmother, who lived this incredible life in her own right, what if any one of these things that she was saying were actually true? And what if she had this other completely secret life that nobody in our family knew about, and it was just starting to come out at the end of her life? And that's really when the character of Louise was born. Because she obviously has quite a big secret life that nobody in her family knows about.
Yes. So, oh my God, that's so amazing. So your grandmother, was she an adventurous woman?
She was
life?
very, very adventurous. We have so many stories. Her and my grandfather traveled literally all over the world, and they have some of the greatest stories that are now just family lore and legend, that we passed down.
What a great legacy this book is, like, in honoring her. That's really awesome. I'm sure that, your grandmother was an inspiration, and that's a great way to start, the book with her stories and the sense of humor. But really, like, what was the writing process for you with this particular book? There's so much going on. There's a bunch of characters kind of thrown together that don't know each other.
Yep.
There's a road trip. There's a secret, more than one. There's, there's all these things. How did the process go for you? And maybe this is the process you use with your other novels as well, but tell us a little bit about that.
So far, this is pretty much how my process has gone. And it's that I generally know where I'm starting. I have done research. I've thought about the characters. I've taken notes for about 6 months to a year before I ever actually start writing the book. And so when I sit down to actually write the book, I'm pretty familiar with my characters and I know where we're starting in their lives. I know the central conflict. I know kind of where I want the book to end up, or I think it's going to end up, and I have no idea how I'm going to get from point A to point B. So that's the process for me, and that's the exciting part, and that's the difficult part a lot of times, because sometimes I'll write myself into a corner and then I'll go, oh, that's not how it's supposed to go, and I'll have to backtrack and see where I messed up.
And I know you mentioned your children, so you're a mom also, and we've had this discussion with other authors who also have families as women. So when do you do your writing, and how do you fit it in with your life?
Yeah, so I have 4 kids between the ages of 8 and 12, almost 13. His birthday's in a couple of weeks. And I really just treat it like my full-time job, because it is. And so when they are in school, well, generally I'll get up before they get up. I'll get up around 5 a.m. and I'll try to write for about an hour, and then get everybody off to school. And then while they're in school, I'm sitting at my desk and writing, or doing the PR or the marketing or any of the other parts of my job that I have to do. And then when they get off the school bus, I put on my mom hat and I'm mom, until they go to bed. And, I'm not one of those that'll pick up writing again in the evening because my brain is just shot at that point. But the other thing that I do is I have an incredible supportive husband. I wouldn't be able to do this without him. And so about 3 or 4 times a year, I will go on writing retreats, because there's something about the creative process where if you don't have anything else going on, then you can just zone in and lock in on the story. And having 3 or 4 days in a row where I don't have to think about laundry or groceries or cooking, or don't have kids asking me 1,000 questions, I'm able to get a lot of words on the page in those days.
That's excellent. And I can only imagine how you manage to, for me, I'm thinking, what do you do when you get in that rut? Some days you just, you don't feel good, or, you can't half do it when it's your work, So if you have a goal in mind for a novel and you're writing, tell us about what it's like to get stuck.
It's awful.
It is, right? I know. We've talked to authors who say that, and I'm always amazed at how they come out of it so well. It does have an end, but I'm sure when you're in it, you're like, oh, forget it.
Oh, it feels like, it's so funny because it's one of those things where that it's part of the process. Logically, as a writer, I know that each book I'm going to be stuck at least once, if not 10 times, which is more likely. But each time, illogically, you think, well, this is it. This is when I get proven that I can't do this. This isn't the right book, or I'm not good at this. And it's so funny. My husband likes to tell the story about, my first book, when I was writing Before I Go, and about halfway through, I got stuck, and I came to him and I was crying. I was so stuck and so frustrated, and I'd never written a book before, and I didn't actually know that it was normal. And I'm crying and I'm so upset. And he was so, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? He wanted to sit down and talk it out. He was so supportive about it. And now I'll come in, I'm stuck and I'm upset. And he'll be like, you're halfway through, you're fine. This is all part of it. He's like, no,
he's used to the process. Yeah.
And I'm like, no, you don't understand. This time is different. He's like, no, you say that every time.
Oh my gosh. Do you turn to your family when that happens? Do you have, or fellow writers? Like,
I do both.
yeah,
I turn to my mom a lot. My mom is super, she just will let me talk it out, and she knows if
good.
I just can talk it out, then sometimes I can work through it. And then I have writer friends, who we all remind each other, you can do this, you can
Yeah.
work through it. But it's nice to just have that cheerleading and the reminder of people who have also been there.
That's awesome. You mentioned the pandemic before, and I couldn't help but wonder if you were writing this book during the pandemic, because I think everyone wanted to just hop in a car and disappear
Yes.
for a while. Was this a pandemic novel?
It was kind of,
Okay.
yes, but I did take about 6 months off from it because I was homeschooling for,
Yeah, that's true.
on 4
Oh my
different
gosh.
computers and trying to make sure that they were actually doing what they were supposed to do. And I mean, it was, everybody knows that we all went through it. Everybody knows how challenging that was. And so I did take that time off. And then when I was able to finally get back to it, the kids were back in school, which is when I was able to finally sit down. So it felt less like pandemic times, even though we were still in it. But also I had just lost my grandmother. And so it was really part of my grieving process. Like, it was very cathartic to me because it was so inspired by her and Louise. I've certainly infused her with a lot of my grandmother's more quirky and fun characteristics. And so I felt like I got to spend time with her, which was really fun.
That is. And I know you said the character of Louise is loosely based on Grandma. Tanner based on you? Any characters based on you?
No, although, and I think most authors would say this, I find myself in probably almost every character I write, a little piece of myself or something that's happened to, because I think that's how you have empathy for the characters. And so with Tanner, she's not like me, but I did, hearken back to when I was in my 20s many, many years ago, and trying to that time period when you're in your early 20s and you don't quite know who you are supposed to be in the world or where you fit in. And everything feels so heightened because you don't have a lot of life experience. And so I was able to remember a lot of those times and relate to Tanner that way, and able to write her character.
Yeah. We spoke, our group, so much about these two women who come together. And one of the discussions we had read, a few of us had read just the beginning couple of chapters, maybe the first 8 chapters we read, and then we discussed a little bit without going ahead, which was interesting because we kind of were talking about how what we saw coming or what we thought would come, which really made the twists and turns just, I would like recommend everyone read this really slow, because it's you want to get to find out what's happening, but it actually is so amazing to stop and think about what you see. And one of the things we saw right away was two women who seemed so different, but really were not. And physically, that was something we talked about. They both had their bodies were just kind of giving out on them.
Yep.
And the reason why they couldn't do what they wanted to do. And how many of us feel that way, women at every stage of life, like not just whether it's pregnancy or, post-pregnancy, but women are always kind of slaves to their physical form more so than the men we know a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of time. And, here we had these two women with these physical issues that were the hip and the knee, and they couldn't seem further apart, yet they were so much alike. And we knew it as readers, but you kind of see them like sort of just tolerating each other. And it was really, really so interesting. And we knew that they were going to come together. We just knew it. It was a promise you kind of made to us from the beginning with the cover, right? They're in that car, their hair is blowing, it's just so great. And we got into this really big debate last week, or discussion about the feminism in this book, and, the debunking of myths of what it means to be a woman in the world, which is such a heavy theme to take on, especially in today's world, honestly, I think. And you did it with an often lighthearted touch, you know. There were moments that made us laugh at that, right? So how do you find the balance? Like, how did you not make it like preachy, but still fun and lighthearted? And really, as women, I mean, I just adored this book for that. How do you
Thank
do
you.
that? How do you make that one?
I really take that compliment to heart, and I really appreciate that, because that is the thing that I work very, very hard on in my books, because I feel like, you know, as a writer, there are things that I want to say, right? Like, that's why I write. There are things that I want to put out in the world, things that, and not answers. I don't have the answer to anything any more than anybody else, but I have questions, and the things that I think about, for my children and their future, and my girls in particular, in the world that they're growing up in. And so I feel like every book that I write is exploring what I'm most interested in at that time in my life. And right now, you know, in our current culture and everything that we're dealing with, that happened to be feminism. And so the way that I really straddle that line is, I don't like to be preached to. I don't like to be talked to by somebody who thinks, if somebody tells you they have all the answers, then they're lying, you know, like, and so I really just try to stick to the idea that I'm exploring what I think through these characters. And that can be done in a very lighthearted, funny way. And so I try to make that my North Star. Like, I'm trying to entertain and have fun, and make sure that readers are having a good time as they're reading it, and I'm having a good time as I'm writing it, while not shying away from deeper, heavier topics, because that's what life is, right?
Right.
So yeah, I don't know if I can explain it any better than that, except that it's a lot of rewriting, because I will let a lot of the cliches and everything come through.
Yes.
Then I have to go back and either pare back or go deeper, or, you know, it's just a lot of rewrites to make sure that I'm threading that line or that needle really carefully.
Yeah, I would imagine that it's so easy to fall into, like you said, the cliches, the things, you know, that we've all heard before, and you want to come, you know, you want to back away from that as much as possible. You know, I love and we love the intergenerational aspect of it. And I think in, you know, I'll talk about my work environment, you know, in a library. We work with women of all ages. We have some have been here for a really long time, others who've been here just starting. And there is this really awesome camaraderie that comes about when you work intergenerationally. And that's with men also, but especially as women who've overcome, you know, a lot of challenges to be in a career. It's such a great thing to see. And I love that you brought these two, which wasn't the case in Thelma and Louise. They maybe slightly, but the age wasn't as, you know, as much of an emphasis. But I love how you brought that intergenerational aspect to it. And it started us talking about Shelby Van Pelt's book, where there also was a very similar, and I said, oh, I hope this is like not just a trend, but like something that is really picked up on, because I think we forget that women of a certain age have a lot to offer, and women at any age have a lot to offer. And I felt like you did it so well with the video games Tanner was playing, which is such a thing, right?
Yeah.
But with kids, but you know, the fact that she was willing to, you know, let her play them all day and allow that, but then want to share in the happy hour and cocktails and do all that stuff, like, which is so traditional. My grandmother would have done that too. And yeah, so I just, you know, I love that you were able to do that. One of the other things besides I'm trying to look, the intergenerational friendship was also the women not needing a man to save them, be it George, which, wow, I had to go back and reread that. And I know we all felt the same way in the group. We were like, oh my gosh, George, like, didn't see that coming at all, but loved that it was there. And August, you know, for me and for a few others, we really liked the idea that Tanner kind of made her own path at the end.
Yeah.
It was very unexpected and refreshing, I think. Did you know
Yeah.
that how that was gonna go?
I did. Obviously August was playing the Brad Pitt role of a little bit of eye candy,
Yes,
right? Gotta
I
have
loved
that. But yeah, I mean, it was very important to me that the two female characters had their own agency and that they weren't dependent. And there's a difference between being dependent on a man and wanting a man in your life, right? Like Louise had Ken and he was wonderful. He was a wonderful husband and she loved him and she missed him. And so that was also really important to me because going back to Thelma and Louise, if you think about that movie, there is not one male character that's redeemable. They're all awful, which I think, which I think the writer of that certainly had something to say, right? And for me, it was very important to me to put male characters that were side characters in the book that were not awful. Because I have men in my life who are not awful. I have very loving, wonderful guys, and it was very important for me to represent that, even though they weren't the main characters, that Tanner and Louise could have agency, but they could also have men in their lives who were good guys, because it's not, men that were fighting, it's a system, it's the patriarchy, and men can be part of that fight, right?
Yeah.
So that was super important to me to kind of turn that idea that was explored in Thelma and Louise on its head.
And I think that's what I loved so much. And when we said that too, is that there were these great male characters, but they weren't great because they saved the women in the book. Right. They were great of their own agency, right? Ken was so wonderful, and and August was August. Like, he was such a cool dude, and it reminded me of like my son's friends, and it's just, he was perfect and in his imperfectness, unlike the movie. You're absolutely right. Which I have to look and see if that movie was written by a woman or a man.
It was written by a woman.
It was.
Yeah, her name's escaping me.
Yeah.
Callie Corey. Callie.
Okay.
Corey, the name of the screenwriter. Yeah, very talented.
Interesting. You mentioned before that you did some research before you started writing. So what kind of research did you do for this, or what do you generally like? How do you, as a librarian, I love to ask, what kind of research do you use? What do you?
So I mostly do expert interviews, because that's really from my journalism days. I love to go right to a source of people who know things. So for this one, I talked to various lawyers, people who were FBI agents, police officers, because it was very important for me, obviously, to get those details right in those scenes. And I didn't know anything about working for the FBI or how protocol would go in some of those scenarios. So that was very enlightening. And then I did a lot of reading on, and I read about feminism, anyway, just because it interests me, but I did a lot of reading on second wave feminism, because that would have been, really kind of Louise's heyday when her and George were working together. And so I wanted to get a really good sense of what the world was like back then. And I just feel like this book really is about what it means to be a woman in the world in 2023, obviously from the perspective of an 84-year-old and a 21-year-old, and how far we've come, in Louise's time, and then how far we have to go, in Tanner's time. And so it was just interesting. I uncovered a lot of things that surprised me and didn't surprise me. Like, I didn't really know, it wasn't until 1974 that a woman could get a credit card without her husband co-signing, which
you mentioned that in the book, right? Isn't that mentioned? Yeah, that was
blows my
mind-blowing.
mind.
Yeah,
it absolutely blows my mind. So I think that's a great example of how far we've come, right? And thank goodness for that. And then another thing I learned was that we didn't have a woman on the Fortune 500 list until 1973. I hope I'm getting that right. And it was Katharine Graham when she took over the Washington Post.
Okay.
And so when I found that out, I thought, well, let me just see how many women are on the Fortune 500 list, in the last year. And it's 40 out of 500, which was like, well, that's better than one, but I think that's a great example of how far we still have to go.
Yeah, very underrepresented. Yeah. Women. Oh, wow. That's really interesting. Um, I was wondering if you also had been reading, or read Lessons in Chemistry,
Oh, I
which,
did. I
yeah.
love the book. I didn't read it until, I mean, I can't remember when it came out, but I didn't read it until way after I had turned in the book and everything. But I love that book.
Because that had a lot of similar, like, eye-opening stories
Yes.
of a woman at that time who didn't fit the mold. And
Yes.
it's still, it's still a very popular book, but I see this happening, these books on women that are really eye-opening into how, like you said, how far we have come, how
Yep.
far we still need to go. But also it's very empowering to read books like this. It reminds you how important those relationships are that you have with other women in your life, that women can not, the competition, like you said, what's been set up in society isn't always what it really is.
Yep.
Working together, we have much more in common than we have, not in common. So, definitely, I did wonder if there was anything you edited out of the book that you'd be able to share with us. And how hard was that?
Yeah, this is such a hard question for me to answer because and nobody recommends this, but I edit as I go, which I think is
Wow.
due to my background in magazines, being an editor and a writer. I have kind of like both sides of that brain. And so it's hard. I don't get to like a whole full first draft and then have to go take out like a bunch of scenes and rewrite a bunch of stuff. When I get to the end of a draft, it's typically like my 57th draft because I've edited so much as I go. So it's really hard for me to remember. Yes, the answer is yes, I edited out a lot, but as I went, so it's hard for me to remember like what scenes were very early on in there that were cut and didn't make it and that kind of thing. I'm sure if I went back, I could find some very cringy things that didn't make it in, but it's hard for me to remember.
The characters on the periphery were really interesting too. Tanner's family, there's a dinner scene at the beginning that is so awkward for Tanner as she's just come back, and and then her parents are kind of oblivious. And then you have also Louise's family in the text, which I have to be honest with you, was just hilarious. The siblings, I don't know where that came from. You'll have to tell us, but those text exchanges were great because it really was. You must have siblings because that's exactly how.
I don't think it'll surprise you to know that I'm the youngest of three, and
There
I have a brother and a sister.
Any of them named Jules? It was so fun to read that. And just how they were also oblivious to their mom to an extent. But aren't we all a little bit when it comes to our mothers? Like, we just like, oh, it's just mom,
Yep.
She's just doing her crazy mom thing. And, it was so that injected into the story just made it so much fun to read. It was already fun, but it really did like bring some real comic relief in there, and really made you appreciate your family. And I loved that. I think we all did. We kind of were laughing about them, but I know the book has garnered an incredible, it was published when? Was it April?
The very end of March, beginning of April.
And you got really a lot of attention with this book very quickly, a lot of press. What was that like for you? And, compared to your other, I mean, you've been writing, it's not like, but I felt like I saw it right away. Like it showed up in everything immediately.
Yeah, it was just really, really exciting. I mean, this is a very, very hard industry, and there are so many books published, all the time, which is wonderful because we have so much so many options of what to read, but it's hard to, it's hard for a book to stand out. And so there's not a lot of expectation. It's like, I wrote a book, who knows if anybody's going to read it? And so when it does get some nice press or attention, or you see it in places, it's just, it's wildly exciting. And that never goes away. I mean, it's like, seeing my very first book on the shelf for the first time or in a magazine was just as exciting as seeing this book on the shelf, and then the press that it got. It's just wildly, wildly exciting.
Oh, that's so great. And we get excited for you. I hope you readers, we feel like a piece of us is in this book too.
Oh.
When you read it, you talk about it with your friends in your book club, and I'm sure my book club folks will agree. Like you kind of, we talked to authors quite a bit. And I know that when I see them after the fact and they have, they've gotten all this praise and everything, and I'm like, yes, that's like our author too. Like we picked them. We knew this was good. And I think readers, like people who are music and with rock stars and stuff, we just get really excited when we find a book we love, and because it touches us, really.
I love that. And I have to say, that's one of my favorite parts about this job, is like the community that I feel like I get to be in and a part of, and like, the people, the readers that I've met that have become friends, and like, I know about their lives and their families, and like, I would never have met them any other way. And the support in the reader community, from librarians to booksellers to readers, is just so much love. And it's an incredible, incredible thing to be a part of.
It really is a great place. And I always tell people that's why I love my books. So, what do you want? I know, what would you like readers to take away from this particular book? I know it's a common question, but time has passed since it was published. What are you seeing, and what are you happy that they're taking from it? And what do you hope they do take from it?
Yeah, so the first and foremost for any book I want is, I just want the reader to be entertained. Definitely that's like the most important thing to me. And for this one in particular, I want it to be an escape, because, the world's kind of terrible enough. And if you can just escape for a little bit on this fun journey with Tanner and Louise, then that's great. And then the second thing that's really important to me is that a reader just makes an emotional connection. Like, I feel like anytime I write a book, I'm saying, this is how I experience being a human. Like, have you ever felt this way too? And it feels like a conversation, with a reader. And so my favorite thing is any kind of reader feedback. If I get an email or a message, on social media, a comment, or even a reader just coming up to me and telling me, oh my gosh, Louise reminded me of my relationship with my grandma or my great aunt, and let me tell you about what we used to do, or that touches me so greatly that I could, remind somebody of somebody special in their life, or like bring those memories back for them. That's the greatest compliment to me.
What about movie, TV? I think our group, we talked about movies. Anything? This is perfectly aligned to be a movie.
Thank you. I can say that it's been optioned.
Round of applause. So, that's great.
Thank you. Yeah. So we currently have a producer who optioned it. She's wonderful, and very excited about it. And she's gotten a writing team on board. And they are waiting for the writer's strike to be over. And as soon as that's over, then they'll be able to hopefully pitch, and maybe all things go well, everything, finger crossed, we'll see it on the big screen one day.
Oh my gosh, that'd be so great. Who's going to play who? Who would be Tanner?
I have a few that I like. I love Millie Bobby Brown from
Stranger Things. Yes.
I think she would be incredible. And then there's an actress named Caitlin Dever, who was in Ticket to Paradise with Julia Roberts and George Clooney. If you saw that, she played the daughter who was getting married. And I think she would be excellent. And then there are so many women that could play Louise, because Hollywood is just rife with like these female actresses in their late 70s, early 80s who are just amazing. So I would love Jane Fonda, I think would be incredible.
Oh, she'd be great.
Yeah, she'd be really good. She can be very sharp and biting. And then even though she's British, I think Maggie Smith would be absolutely
Ah,
incredible. Yeah, Shirley MacLaine would be awesome. Like
absolutely.
there's just, I don't know if you could go wrong because there's so many.
Yes.
Did your book group have any that they thought? Did you guys talk about casting?
I feel like we did. Who were we talking about? It's gonna slip I won't remember. But we usually we always, if anybody remembers who we said, jump in. I remember Debbie mentioned somebody to play Louise. Debbie's a fan of Golden Girls, so I know she said I think, did she say like a bet? She might have said if Betty White was here, Betty White would have been a good
Yes.
Louise.
So my
That's what she
agent-
said.
Yes, my agent was obsessed with the idea of Betty White playing Louise, and
Oh.
she was devastated. I mean, we were all devastated when Betty
Yes.
died, but my agent was like, no, she can't play Louise.
That's so funny. Yes, I'll have to mention to Debbie that she was right on the nose with Betty White. Young actresses, I have to say, I know them when I see them. I know Millie Bobby Brown from Stranger Things. I feel like she would be great. I don't know a lot of the younger actresses by name, but yeah, absolutely. I feel like this is just so perfect for a movie. So a couple of last questions before we do like a quick lightning round, but what are you working on now? And tell us some of the things that you might recommend for us to read that might not be on our radar. So what are you working on? You got something coming up?
I do. I can only say a little thing about it, but I'll give a small teaser. So I'm working on a book about a couple who's been married for 19 years. And they're kind of teetering on the brink of divorce. And they go out to a restaurant, a very high-end, like 3-star Michelin restaurant on the coast of California for dinner. And an underground eco-terrorist group bursts in and takes the entire restaurant hostage.
Oh, wow. Didn't see that coming.
Yep. And it's called Jane and Dan at the End of the World.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so it has a little humor in it.
Yes, of course, my books.
That is awesome. Jane and Dan at the End of the World.
Yeah,
I'm writing that down. When can we expect to see that?
Probably spring 2025. I'm about halfway done. So yeah, so hopefully spring, summer 2025. And I have been on a tear of reading amazing books.
Oh, tell us. We love
recently.
it.
So one of the ones that I highly recommend, if you love historical fiction, is called The Woman with the Cure by Lynn Cullen. Do you know that book?
I don't.
So it's so Lynn Cullen is an amazing author. I think this is her 5th book. She finds those like female historical figures that we never hear about or know about,
Yes.
we haven't learned about them in school, and she kind of shines a spotlight on them. So this one is about Dorothy Hodgkins, who was the female scientist who was integral to finding the polio vaccine. Which, who knew that a female was, because you only hear about Jonas and Salk. And so, and it is amazing. I read it in one night. I blew through it, which for historical fiction, I generally take my time. So that's saying a lot. So that one I highly recommend. Another historical fiction that I loved is The Paris Daughter by Kristen Harmel, which just came out. Blew through that in like 2 nights. I loved the book, The God of Endings, and I'm going to butcher the name. It's Jacqueline somebody, but it's definitely about a vampire, which is weird, but it was so well done. Like really, really great book. And then another book I loved, which was also a little weird and dark, was called Notes on an Execution by Dania Kukafka.
Yeah.
That was, but that like literally blew my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then one more that I'd love that's super fun and peppy is called The Daydreams by Laura Hankin. And that book is about 4 teen pop stars from the early 2000s who had this big scandalous breakup. They were like, picture like Nickelodeon stars that form a band.
Yeah.
And so in present time, there's pressure for them to do this reunion. And there's all this stuff that they have to work through. And it was so pitch perfect, so funny, but also very sharply insightful on how, media and culture treated these female, pop stars, particularly in that time period in the early 2000s. Think like the Jessica Simpsons and the Britney Spears.
Sure.
And, so there's a lot of sharp, insightful social commentary, but it's also just dishy and wildly entertaining. I loved it.
Oh, that sounds great. And just give me the name of that first one about the polio vaccine.
Yes, so that one is The Woman with the Cure by Lynn Cullen.
I'm writing these all down because everyone will ask, and then I'll say, well, Colleen Oakley recommended them. So no, that's great. Very excited for Jane and Dan too. That sounds hilarious, right up my alley. So maybe that'll be our summer one for that. If that's
There we go.
we can fit that in really well. So Debbie always helps me with the lightning round, but I'm going to do it anyway. We have a few minutes left. Just reminding everyone, put any questions in the chat if you can. And right before we end, I'll put you guys on if we have a minute. So a quick timer, 1 minute, stopwatch. Okay. Which character from your novel, this one, would you like to have a drink or coffee with?
Oh, Louise, hands down.
Yeah.
Although maybe August for the eye candy.
I love it. And what do you like to do to relax?
Crossword puzzles.
Ooh.
Yep.
What shows have you been binging?
Ted Lasso, loved Ted Lasso, and Marvelous Miss Maisel.
That's great. When it comes to movies, the theater or the couch?
Both.
That was a good after pandemic question.
Yeah.
What books were you forced to read but enjoyed, like in school?
Oh, Their Eyes Were Watching God. I forced to read that in high school, and now I've reread it probably 6 times. It's just one of my favorite books of all time.
And then, okay, 10 seconds. What would your readers never expect to know about you?
Oh gosh. Oh, I have chickens. I have 4 chickens.
Really unexpected. 4 kids, 4 chickens. One for each kid.
That's right.
Oh my God, that's great. That's terrific. Thank you for doing that little fun thing.
That was fun.
To do that. So I do see that we have some folks who have, I'm going to ask everyone if you can unmute yourself, and we have about 4 minutes. We could do some questions. Is that okay? Colleen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I'd love to see everyone.
If anyone has, come on and say hello to Colleen. We're a small group. I will going to click all of your names so you can unmute if you like, and feel free to come on and say hello. Unless you're camera shy.
That's okay too.
I see that we had some suggestions of also a few things. iPhone doesn't have a name, but suggests Sophia Stallone, Jodie Sweetin, and Amber Montana. Oh, for Tana. Yeah.
I'll have to, I know Jodie Sweetin. I'll have to look up Amber and Sophia. I don't know if I'm familiar with them. But
yeah.
Awesome.
And Courtney Cox, Danielle Fisher, Jennifer Aniston, Margot Robbie. Yeah, those are great ones. Yes. I think I see Barbara at the top of your head. You have a question for Colleen? Oh, no, it's Pat. Hey, Pat.
Sorry, my screen wasn't in the right way. No, I just wanted to add, when you were throwing out the names, I was thinking Lily Tomlin.
Oh yes, she'd be incredible.
Yeah,
so funny.
Yeah, she would be good. I just want to say I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I've put into my queue to get your other books, so I'm really excited to be reading them too. And I thoroughly enjoyed this interview tonight. So thank you for participating with us.
Thank you. So nice to meet you.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Melinda.
Hi, Melinda.
Nice to meet you. You are Miss Henry, right?
Oh,
Oh, no.
Colleen. Henry's
Colleen?
husband.
Colleen?
Oh,
Henry is-
Colleen.
Yes, she has Henry on her computer. Yes.
Oh, because she's living. Oh, you have a family member named Henry, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
no
Thanks.
problem.
So I know we all love the book. I'm so glad that you were able to be here with us this evening, Colleen. Really, it's been, and you're rapid fire with the emails too, by the way. I'm like, I told everyone, I'm like, she has to be nice because she answered the emails like immediately.
I will tell you, the reason I do that is because I have 4 kids, and if I don't answer, you will never hear from me.
I understand. I get it. I get it. Well, we really loved this novel so much, and we are constantly buying more copies because it's one of the ones that we are all recommending. We can't wait for the next one. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
One more question.
Oh, yes. One
Yeah.
more. Go for it.
Colleen, when did you write that book, Tanner and Louise?
I wrote it 2020. So 2020, and I finished it in 2021. Took me about 1.5 years.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Great.
That's something. Mhm.
It is. Well, thank you again, Colleen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much. I
Yes,
appreciate your support so much. Thank you.
be well.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Alrighty.